you very much for having me here to speak today. I'm just going to start off with a quick correction, which is that I didn't campaign for Jane Austen on a banknote, because we don't have a lack of Jane Austen on a banknote problem. We have a lack of women on a banknote problem. So I was just campaigning for female representation. And that's kind of relevant to what I'm talking about today, because I'm talking about how often we seem to forget that women are 50% of the population in all sorts of areas. And in particular, this is a problem when we start talking about big data, because if the data doesn't adequately represent the human population, you're going to have a bit of a problem when you start creating policy around it, when you start creating products around it. So I just want to start with an analogy to set the scene. And I just want you to imagine a world where we know absolutely nothing about women. I'm talking basic female anatomy. I am, of course, talking about Grand Theft Auto. And Grand Theft Auto 5, to be specific, which was the first time that, not in the main game, but in the online version, they had playable female characters. The reason that they didn't have playable female characters in the real game was that, well, this is the reason they gave, was that the characters needed to have narrative arcs. And as we all know, women are famous for not having narrative arcs. Anyway, but you could play as a woman in the online version. And so obviously, being the rabid feminist that I am looking for trouble, I thought, well, I'm just going to go and see what playing as a female really means here. So I was looking at all the options you could have. You know, you can choose the ethnicity, you can choose the hair, the dress, the makeup. I thought, aha, bet they don't let men wear makeup. But they do. Good on GTA, they let men wear makeup. But anyway, as you start playing, for those of you who've played GTA, you'll know that one of the things that you can do is you can pick up a nice lady in your car and ask her to do things to you, or pay her, really, to do things to you. And they have three options. And so you're driving around as a lady, trying to pick up another lady. And anyway, you manage to convince one, and she's like, you know, and you're like, well, what do you do? And she says, well, you know, I've got these three options. And you're like, well, I'll go for the first option. And then this woman's head comes and starts going up and down in your lap. And you're like, haven't got one of them. It's not really doing anything for me. Actually, it's kind of embarrassing if you could just stop now. So obviously, to be clear, I am not saying that blowjobs for women is my campaign for the following year. But as I said, I think it's a really interesting analogy for what happens if we build a world designed around male needs and then just stick women in there and kind of hope it's all going to work out because, you know, men and women are the same, right? So to the data gap more specifically. First of all, what do I mean when I say the gender data gap? Very simply, the gender data gap is a lack of data about women compared to men, either because, and that's the usual reason, the data isn't collected at all, or because it's not disaggregated by sex. Sometimes it's actually also because of poorly designed data collection systems. So, for example, there's a huge problem in the field of development because traditional household surveys have been designed around male working patterns, which is that you have one job and you go from, you know, you have a normal working day, whereas women tend to have a much more complex working patterns. They may be working 2 or 3 jobs. They've got unpaid work to do as well. But the traditional household surveys only asked about each person's main occupation, and so women tended to say unpaid care work. But it didn't mean that they weren't working a full productive work week as well. It just meant that they had different forms of work. Women in Bangladesh, for example, can work for as long as 17 hours a day. And whole swathes of women's paid work was unrecorded as a result. So that's what the gender data gap is. Why does it matter? In the example I've just given, in agriculture, actually, agriculture is one of the main forms of the women's unpaid work, women's paid work that wasn't collected. It meant a whole load of aid policies were developed and implemented that only served male farmers' needs and completely left women behind. And so as a result, female farmers started doing worse and worse and worse, and people started thinking, well, female farmers are just really rubbish, like, come on, guys, catch up. But what actually happened was that male farmers were being given a leg up. Anyway, so this is this issue of design that only accounts for male needs is an issue that crops up in all sorts of areas, from transport, I'm sure a lot of the women here will recognize this, to medicine, to the workplace. This is what comes up when you search Google images for human. I find it really interesting that weird, like, whatever he is, man, comes up before a woman, but anyway. So to be clear, I'm obviously not saying that Google is the baddie here. This is actually a pretty accurate representation of what people mean when they say human. In fact, I was at Foyle's bookshop yesterday looking through medical anatomy textbooks and posters, because I sure know how to have fun. And it was fascinating to me how, even in these medical textbooks, these medical posters, it was still just drawings of male bodies. There was one that I really enjoyed, which was the human vascular system, which was, a drawing of a man, and then they had the little picture of the female pelvis to one side. But I mean, at least the female pelvis was included, which, is a step forward. Anyway, let me give you some more examples of how we tend to think of male when we think of human, and only female when we specify female. So you've got here the Lego Time Teacher minifigure watch and clock, which is blue. It's obviously for a boy. Girls can't have blue. And the Lego Time Teacher girl minifigure watch and clock. So they're exactly the same, except for the one that's called girl is for girls. Don't really know what's going on here, but thanks Walmart for illustrating my point so brilliantly. Yeah. This is a great product from BIC. It's actually been taken out of circulation now. I know this because I spoke to BIC about it. Anyway, BIC for her, turned out we thought we'd been using gender-neutral pens. Turned out there'd been men pens all along and we hadn't realised. As part of my research for my book, I actually did get in touch with BIC because the product description says the pen is designed to fit comfortably in a woman's hand. And I wanted to know if they'd actually done any research into whether or not the female hand did need a different pen. And be fair, guys, women do tend to have smaller hands than men. And this actually is a problem in all sorts of areas. For example, huge smartphones that were very, very fashionable a couple of years ago. My iPhone 6 gave me RSI. Tools being too large for women's hands is a particular problem in the construction industry. A friend of mine told me about trying to change the head on a Black & Decker strimmer. This was homework, by the way. She's not in the construction industry, but still, listen to her story. When it's attached, in order to change it, you have to press both tabs at the same time to release it. I think the man they had in mind would do this in one movement, but the span was too wide for my hand, and the pressure required too much for my thumbs to do both at the same time. Just to sort of break for a second there, hand grip is actually also a huge difference between men and women. In fact, the average 20-year-old woman has around the same hand grip strength as the average 70-year-old man. So there's quite a big difference there. So that's probably what was partly going on there. Anyway, she continues, and I'm 5'7", maddening. Yes, my friends do send me these stories all the time. I'm a lucky girl. Eventually worked out I could press one in first to release it, wedge something in to stop it springing back into place, then do the other one. They obviously never tested it on a woman, she concluded. Another friend recently sent me a picture of her hand covered in plasters after taking up the flooring in her house. She couldn't find any work gloves to fit her teeny tiny hand size, and so on. Anyway, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into details about my exchange with BIC pens, and let me assure you, it was a thrill ride. But let's just say the words fashion-oriented customers came up, and I feel pretty confident in saying that the BIC for her range was not in fact based on any kind of sex disaggregated data on hand size. Anyway, when it comes to designing things that don't work for the female body, hands are far from the only problem. I'm sure a lot of you will remember when the Apple Health app was released with much fanfare a couple of years ago, accompanied by words like comprehensive. And sure, it was pretty comprehensive. It included tracking for things like copper intake and molybdenum. Impressive. I don't know what that is. But although the Health app wasn't called Health for Men, it did have a rather glaring omission that kind of put a dampener on the whole comprehensive thing. So yeah, I mean, basically it seemed like Apple took these Google results for human, remember these, rather too literally and kind of forgot all about that. Yeah, they didn't have a menstrual tracker, which is kind of basic for women's health. I mean, it's kind of the #1 thing you might think of that women might want to track. But it gets more serious than smartphones and Grand Theft Auto failing to account for basic female anatomy. There's a serious gender data gap actually in medicine as well. So women are almost twice as likely as men to have an adverse reaction to a drug, and 80% of drugs withdrawn from the market are due to unacceptable side effects in women. And this is partly because women are hugely, and have historically been hugely, underrepresented in medical trials. We typically make up about 20 to 30%, and it's actually worse when it comes to animal trials, which is of course how phase 1 trials happen. Even when a drug is specifically aimed at women. So you may remember the female Viagra that was being talked about last year and everyone was really excited about it. But it turned out there was a potential interaction with alcohol. And so the designers of the drug were like, well, you know, we're very responsible people. We should probably test this, you know, see what the deal is. So they designed a test and they tested it on 23 men and 2 women. And that's probably fine, right? Because men don't have different alcohol tolerance to women. We don't metabolize that differently. It'll be fine. Yeah, so that was a small problem. Anyway, the lack of representation is for a number of reasons, which, again, I don't really have time to go into, but the least convincing of which is that the menstrual cycle makes women too variable to be able to test, which is, you know, all very well, and I'm so delighted for you guys in the room that you've got such lovely, simple bodies. But the problem is we literally do have a menstrual cycle, and so when we put medication in our body, we kind of need to know how it's going to affect us. So emerging evidence suggests, for example, antidepressants can vary over the course of the menstrual cycle. Subsequently, drug dosages may be too high at some points and too low at others. Heart attacks is another example. So there's a certain type of heart medication that has actually been shown to cause a specific kind of heart arrhythmia in women, and it's much more dangerous during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. So you can see it really does matter that the women's menstrual cycles are taken into account, even if it is much more difficult. I'm sorry, scientists, that's just, you know, women are complicated, what can I tell you? So staying with hearts, rather like the human thing, this is what comes up when you search Google for heart attack, and as you can see, only men have heart attacks. Obviously that's not true. So the perception, of course, is that heart disease is a male disease, but ischemic heart disease is the #1 killer of US and European women. Up to 28,000 women a year in the UK die from heart attacks. Women are, in fact, more likely to die following a heart attack than men are. And recent research from the UK found that women were 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed following a heart attack. And for some types of heart attack, that figure was almost 60%. So, you know, we're not just talking about people like you and me here, we're actually talking about medical professionals misdiagnosing women because women's symptoms are considered atypical. 50% of the population, that's pretty atypical. So yeah, it's partly because of a lack of awareness amongst both the public and doctors. But it actually goes beyond that. It's not just awareness. So a lot of the tests and clinical standards, and this is where the data comes in, have been designed using data from studies done on male bodies. Again, around 20% of the subjects are female. And usually when it comes to a specific study, the number will be so low that it's not even statistically significant. You've just got a couple of women in there. You can't really draw many conclusions from it. Essentially, the tests that have been designed may not detect the problems with women's hearts, and they may be sent home saying there's nothing wrong with you. It's also an issue with treatment. I'm just going to give you one example of that. Pacemakers are more likely to be used in men than women. We don't really know why, but academics suggest this may be because of scarce scientific evidence that they work in women. Hello, data gap. So there's a heart implant called a CRT-D, which is basically a more complicated version of a pacemaker, which is used on patients who have a thing called a left bundle branch block, which basically means, and I've had to learn how the heart works, it's really complicated, but basically what it means is that the contraction of your left ventricle is slightly delayed. So basically there's an electrical circuit that goes around your heart for every time you pump blood around your body and get it back into the heart. And there's a certain amount of time that's meant to take. And so in this instance, there's this one part of it that's delayed. And the sort of guidelines for when you're meant to insert this heart implant for people who have a problem with their electrical signals is that if it takes 150 milliseconds or longer, you should have one inserted. And this is based on a wealth of study data, but you can see what's happening here. Women only represent around 20% of participants in CRT studies. And the figures, as I said, are so low that individual studies can't produce sex disaggregated data that actually means anything. But luckily for women, this is where big data can be helpful. Actually, the FDA combined a whole bunch of studies that had been done. And this isn't the best way of doing things. The best way is always going to be a randomized clinical trial, but this is the second best. You stick a whole load of randomized clinical trials together and you finally get enough women to be able to make some kind of pronouncement. And what they found was that actually women benefited from the insertion of a CRT-D when their electrical circuit lasted between 130 to 149 milliseconds. So that's quite a lot lower than the male threshold. In fact, women in this group had, wait for it, a 76% reduction in heart failure or death, and a 76% reduction in death alone if they had a QRTD inserted in them and in this lower threshold. So all these women were dying because the threshold was set too high for the female heart. Sometimes it's not just about whether or not you have the data. It's about how you use the data. And are you using it in a gender-sensitive way? Or, to put it another way, do you have sex disaggregated data on how to handle your data? So I'm going to give you a real-world example of how this might play out, which just came up completely randomly, really, in an interview I was doing for my book about something completely different. I was talking to a neuroscientist, and it was just after Trump had got elected, so obviously we started talking about the American election. And she told me that she had been in America getting out the vote for Hillary Clinton, and told me about how she and her fellow volunteers had gone knocking on doors where a Clinton supporter was known to live. And quite a few times the door got answered by a man who, when he found out that they were Democrats, got extremely angry and slammed the door in their face. So these men, it turned out, did not support Hillary Clinton, nor did they appear to know that their wives did. And this woman was kind of worried, given the high rates of domestic violence in America and how very angry these men were, that there was a chance she may have triggered some domestic violence incidents. Obviously, we don't know. She's just basing that on possibility. Probably better not to run that risk, though. Around 4 million women a year in America are beaten in their homes by their male partners or ex-partners. I personally wouldn't like to play those odds. So rather like Apple with its health kit, domestic violence stats are actually a type of data available to political parties. They should make use of them. This same woman, in fact, who's an academic at a university, also told me about the vitriolic abuse she received over email after a talk she gave at a festival last summer. Her abusers had found her email address on her university website, which is, of course, pretty standard. As a rule, all academics have a direct email address listed on their university website page. And that can be pretty debilitating as a female academic. You're just trying to get on with your research, and you've got the all and sundry able to send you emails whenever they want. I actually used to have a contact form on my website, which I removed in the end because I was getting work through it, but also I was getting a hell of a lot of abuse. And it's not just the actual abusive emails, it's every time you get a ping, you're like, oh, is this going to be a death threat? Oh, I'm not really feeling it today, thanks guys. So anyway, I removed that. But you know, you have to question, are universities thinking about this when they're applying this blanket policy? Are they providing their female staff with extra support to help deal with the abusive emails they're going to get? As far as I'm aware, they're not. So I'm just going to give one, it's really hot under these lights. I'm just going to give one more example. By the way, oh no, wait, that's not true. Never mind. Women do have different body temperatures to men, but actually they tend to be lower. So it's not your fault. It's not a male default room. Anyway, so one more example of how organisations can fail to design products that cater to both male and female needs, even when there is actually already data in existence. And this one's personal to me. So some of you may know, or in fact you all know, because I mentioned it right at the beginning, that I campaigned for female representation on English banknotes. And, you know, nothing crazy, just a line drawing of one woman for one note. Anyway, that campaign was won, and I was delighted. Battle over. Not so fast, lady, said the men of Twitter, who were not happy. In fact, they were mad as hell about this line drawing of a lady, and they weren't going to stand for it. And they demonstrated how much they were not going to stand for it by sending me some tweets. So, just going to give you some examples of how angry some men got about a line drawing of a woman on a piece of paper. This is the kind of stuff they were going to do to me. Anyway, so these obviously are kind of horrifying and terrifying, but they didn't mean it right. Like, they weren't really going to come and do this to me. Probably not. I mean, I didn't know who they were, didn't know where they were, didn't know what they were capable of. They were coming in every minute, but probably wouldn't happen, right? And then I started getting this. So what had happened with this was that they'd started spamming me even, through Ask FM. I'm sure you all know how that works. Some of you look very confused, so I'll explain it. It's basically a platform where you can anonymously ask a user a question, and their answer gets tweeted automatically. And if you include the Twitter handle in question, as mine was included, then I get notified when this random person tweets out. So I was basically getting a tweet every minute saying, "We know where you live," and there was no way to stop it. Just to clarify, thankfully this actually isn't my home address. They did have my correct email, but you're not getting that. That was an office address. But they'd found that address. What else could they find? And there was nothing set up at Twitter or Ask FM at the time to help me deal with this properly. I'm pleased to say a lot has changed at Twitter since then, but prior to this experience of mine and all the attendant media coverage, Twitter was simply not set up to deal with the fact that women routinely get abuse online in a way men simply don't tend to. The reporting and blocking procedures were completely inadequate for abuse at such a volume. They were clearly set up for just some minor irritants that you had time to fill in a 5-minute form that was on a different website and, describing everything that had been said to you. So I'd have to type in, "We are going to mutilate your genitals and shove a pole up your vagina." I didn't really want to type that out. Just to give you an idea of gender discrepancy in online abuse, there's a fascinating pre-Twitter study done by Maryland University, which was in chat rooms. As I said, it's before Twitter. And they set up a bunch of fake accounts, each with either a standard male or female name. And they found that men got on average 3 abusive messages a day. Women got 100. And the reason I'm telling you about this particular research, when of course there's been a wealth of research done since then, is to demonstrate that this sex disaggregated data was actually available by the time that Twitter was being built. So rather like you have to assume that the Apple Health Kit developers knew that women had wombs and periods when they didn't include a period tracker in their comprehensive health app, Twitter could have considered this data when they were building their product and produced a platform that from the very beginning accounted for the way that women are abused online. Instead, they are now having to play catch up, and that's much harder for them when they're trying to change a culture that has already become abusive. So we live in an era of big data, and we're meant to be really excited about that. And I would like to share in that excitement. But at the moment, my excitement is tempered by 2 things. First of all, I know there are huge gaps in our knowledge when it comes to women, which means that any use of big data to design anything from consumer products to government policy is hugely problematic and potentially dangerous. But also that there are countless examples of even when data does exist, we are simply failing to use it because we are just so used to thinking that this is what a human looks like. So I barely had time to scratch the surface in this talk today, but hopefully it's given you a bit of an idea of the scale of the issue. And I'm going to finish now. I'd just like to close with a simple plea. Just one action to take away from this and into your life, your work life, your day-to-day life. It's very, very simple, don't worry. All I'm asking is that when you start on any new project, you stop for just 1 second and you ask yourself a very simple question. Have we remembered to think about the 50% of the population that just happens not to be male? Thank you very much.